A boy points at a grave and says the twins live in the dump with me. The words cut the cemetery air like wind through thin branches. People turned as one. A few birds startled and flew off in a grey scatter. Marina's fingers tightened on the frame she kept pressed to her chest. A photograph of two tiny faces wrapped in hospital blankets, names written on the back in a careful hand. 2 years and 3 months had passed since the day she'd been told there was nothing to be done. She had come back today because grief taught her the ritual of return. She had come back because the anniversary of a life that had only lasted a heartbeat did not go away just because months did. The tombstone was cold under her palms. The name etched in stone felt permanent in a way that memory was not. Rodrigo stood behind her, jaw set, the man who had learned how to hold grief in public and fury in private. He had been the first to hear the boy's claim. He was the first to make the sign of the keys that meant ready to do something. The boy, small, hair clipped unevenly, one ear pierced, stood with his hand outstretched. He looked 9, no more than 10. His face was unself-conscious. He said it again with a steady certainty that had nothing of malice and everything of someone who had learned to speak truth to be seen. They live with me. They live in the dump. Silence stayed in the space between Marina's next breath and the one after. People around them made little sounds. A chair scraping, someone clearing a throat, a child asking why the adults were frozen. The priest a few steps away closed his eyes. The photograph in Marina's hands trembled. Juan Paulo. Everyone in the neighborhood called him Biquinho because of the slight cleft at the mouth that gave him a permanent questioning half-smile, shrugged as if naming the obvious. He had been there that morning, he said, watching as Marina placed flowers. He had seen her with the photograph. He had watched her kneel. He had seen the man put his hand on his wife's shoulder and say words that did not reach the inside of her chest. "They are not here," he had heard. "They're not here," he told Marina now. "They live with me." He had pointed to the west side of the city, to a place people called the Lixo, but which, for the families who lived there, was a neighborhood with names and rules and relationships. Rodrigo moved first. He let his hand close around Marina's elbow and guided her away from the grave in a motion that was at once protective and decisive. He did not speak to Juan Paulo. He did not need to. The boy's small frame, the dirt rimmed in his fingernails, the way his boots were too big for his feet, all said that he had learned how the world worked in ways Marina and Rodrigo had not expected to encounter anymore. Marina slid her thumb over the edge of the photograph until the ink blurred under the motion. The babies, Pedro and Paulo, had been born at Hospital São Lucas. She could recite the names of the nurses who had held them within minutes of birth. She could remember the smell of antiseptic, the way Rodrigo had laughed at her for mistaking the squeak of the incubator for a mechanical bird. She remembered the day a doctor in a white coat had taken both of their hands and, with a voice that carried a false softness, had told them there had been a complication, a word that later, in the blur of morning, became a shield against asking too many questions. The hospital had been where the story of loss began. It would sit in the background now, as a label in her memory. São Lucas. She looked at João Paulo, at his face. For the first time in months, she felt something her sorrow had mostly starved out of her. An inexplicable hope, reckless as new leaves in spring. It arrived without an invitation and sat heavy in her throat. Rodrigo was not convinced. He always lived on the edges of things like this, practical first, protective second. The idea of walking into the West Zone, of threading into a place that smelled of char and old fires, of negotiating with people who had learned to survive by rules that differed from the ones he knew, filled him with a different sort of dread. But he did not speak the way he felt. Instead, he asked questions that had to be asked. Where? How long? Why now? Juan Paulo told them what little he knew. His mother had died 2 summers back of fever. The boy had been left to the city and then to the dump, where he learned the rules quickly. Which alleys were safe, which people could be trusted with a secret, where he could nap while someone watched his back. He had found the twins when they were still small, he said. He remembered the way Conceição would tuck them in. He remembered the sound of a lullaby that smelled like petrol and papaya. He had called the woman grandmother because that was the language for the affection she offered. Marina had to sit on a nearby bench. The cemetery's gravel was coarse under her hands. A small, stubborn sun glinted off the edge of the tombstone, as if nervous. She closed her eyes. 2 years and 3 months is a long time. It is long enough that hope becomes fragile, like a porcelain cup you're afraid to hold. It is long enough for the world to have redrawn its lines, for new routines to take root in the empty spaces left by the dead. Yet here, standing in public, with a boy pointing like he had discovered a treasure, something loosened in her. It felt like an obligation and an invitation at once, to go and see, to risk being hurt again. No matter what, Rodrigo said finally, and the sentence held all the things that had been warring in him: doubt, protection, the memory of nights spent rocking the small phantom weight of his grief. We go, we ask, we do not take, not without talking. There was a brief pause among the onlookers, a ripple of curiosity and concern. Then Marina, who had been a woman of steady decisions even when her heart was cracked, rose. She smoothed the hem of her dress as if trying to press her grief into a tidy shape, and stood so quickly that the photograph shifted in her hands. She met João Paulo's eyes and, with the kind of voice that does not ask for courage but simply steps into it, told him she would come. If this story moves you, alike helps others find it. They left the cemetery, and the city folded around them like a map made of neighborhoods and names. The drive to the West Zone was a slide through the city's layers. Polished avenues with cafes and glass facades gave way to neighborhoods where tiles were missing from roofs, and shop fronts kept their lights late into the night. The air changed in the car as they drove. The scent of exhaust became mingled with wood smoke and the thin, sweet tang of street food. João Paulo sat between them in the back seat, knees against the seat in front, feet swinging. He told them in short sentences about Conceição, how she was older than most of them, how she had a laugh that started slow and ended warm, how she had a way of making burlap sacks into blankets. He did not speak of when or how he first found the twins. The boy's mouth shut in a way the city had taught him to keep certain stories private. Marina watched his profile. The boy's eyes were large and bright. They had the quickness of someone used to looking for details that mattered. Rodrigo glanced at him too, then back to Marina. In the rearview mirror, the three of them made a line that suggested a strange, nascent family on the move. The Lixão rose on the horizon like a low city of its own. It was a place that carried a sound, the soft, continuous rustling of plastic, the far-off call of scavengers, the cyclical clatter of metal against metal. It smelled of burning in some places, wet earth in others, a sharpness of old fruit and detergent. But those who lived there would have argued that dump was not the whole of it. It had its own markets and children who learned to count not by school arithmetic but by the rhythm of a day's haul. It had names for alleys and rules for who knocked on which shack after sunset. It had families. Conceição waited for them at the edge, sleeves rolled up, hair braided back with a faded scarf. She stood straight, though her back had the curve of someone who had bent for many years. She was small, but not fragile. When Marina saw her, the woman's face opened into a smile that did not feel performative. It was the kind of smile that had been practiced across many breakfasts, many sorrows, and not the sort that sought pity. "You must be Marina," she said. Her voice had the husk of many years, but carried an ease that suggested she had settled into the truth of who she was. She called them by name, as if she had been waiting for this day to tie the names to faces. Around her, people paused their work, but not in reverence, rather in the practical way neighbours stopped long enough to acknowledge a passing stranger. Rodrigo, who sold cups of strong coffee near an improvised stall, gave Marina a look that was half curiosity, half counsel. Joaquim, local to everyone and nobody's official elder, nodded and turned back to the pile he was sorting. The twin boys, Pedro and Paulo, were there, small and quick, their cheeks smudged with the kind of dirt that comes from play. They wore shirts a size too large and had a handmade toy car between them, which they pushed along with fierce concentration. Conceição moved among them like a compass, pausing to straighten a shirt, to wipe a face, to pluck a strand of hair behind an ear. There was attentiveness in her gestures, a litany of care learned in a lifetime of keeping others from falling apart. Marina watched, the photograph now tucked carefully into a pocket, and felt something that slid past wonder into the rawness of recognition. There is a way a hand curls around a small wrist, or the way a child leans into a shoulder that can wake the bones of memory. She found herself counting freckles, the slope of an eyebrow, the angle of a laugh. Her hands began to move without instruction. She stepped forward and crouched until she was at eye level with Pedro, then Paulo, and in that motion something inside her gave. She put a hand on a small head, felt warm skin under stubbled hair, noticed a faint scar on one temple where, weeks after the funeral, she had insisted it might have been from an accident long ago. They let her touch. The boys were careful and quick with strangers, but they did not pull away. Conceição watched from a short distance, her posture relaxed but attentive. "This is hard," Marina said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was told they died." Conceição's face softened into a kind of double vision, past stiffness, present calm. "People die here and they get buried where there is space," she said. "People die at hospitals too. Sometimes stories change." She did not accuse anyone. She simply stated what she had seen. Then she added, without drama, "But these boys, they were never left alone. We fed them. We kept them clothed. They were littler then. They called me Conceição. They called Biquinho the cousin." There was no claim in the words, just facts, given as a local historian might relate events. Marina found she could breathe enough to ask the most practical question. She asked to be allowed to hold them more than once. She asked for their names, which Conceição gave in the familiar way one gives names to neighbours, precise, steady. She asked how long they had been with Conceição. Conceição hesitated a fraction. "About 2 years," she said, and her eyes shifted to the photograph that Marina had tucked away. 2 years. The coincidence jarred Marina's bones like a sudden cold. It matched, too closely, the time frame in her own memory. 2 years and 3 months. The extra 3 months sat between the numbers like noise. The conversation turned, as all such turns do, to questions that carried the weight of the rest of the story. If they were her children, then what? If they were not, could she bear telling them so? If the hospital had erred, what did that mean for those who had cared for them, who had the right to decide? Conceição surprised them both. She did not cling to the boys in possessive silence. She did not offer to hand them over. Instead, she proposed terms, not out of suspicion, but out of the dignity she had learned to demand. The children, she said, would not be taken without a plan. She wanted guarantees that the boys would be cared for, that she would not be shut out, that whatever happened would happen with their best interest in mind. She wanted quietly for the boys to be allowed visits, to keep the objects of their life there, the toy car, the small rug, the bowl they loved. She wanted transparency and respect. Marina listened. There was mercy in the list of conditions. There was also rationality, the request to stay involved, to remain twice a week to sit with the children was as much a protection for Conceição as it was for the boys. Conceição had no legal claim, not in any paperwork Marina had seen, but she had an ethical claim that came from the labor of care. She had raised them in many ways. Marina thought of the photograph again and realized the act of laying flowers at the grave would be insufficient without accounting for the life that had continued elsewhere. Rodrigo, who had been quiet, shifted his weight. He had come from a world of contracts and proofs. He wanted evidence. He said so. He did not speak harshly, but he spoke plainly. DNA. A test. He spoke as if naming the test would tidy the unruly knot of emotions. Conceição, unsurprisingly, knew this. She had seen enough of the city to understand that the world often asked for paper and numbers even when bodies carried truth. She did not balk. She demanded that the testing be done respectfully, that they choose a neutral worker to collect samples, and that the children be kept close to the adults they trusted while the work happened. The first physical contact between Marina and the boys had been tentative, but the second happened differently. When the woman from the community health center, a nurse with gentle hands and an accreditation card that read São Lucas Outreach, prepared the swabs, Marina stood near as if drawn by a force she could not name. She had to put something into the world that meant she would not step away without knowing. She took the boys on her lap and felt the quickness of their heartbeat under her palm. One of them frowned slightly as the cotton swab brushed the inside of his cheek. The other watched Marina's face with a steadiness that made her dizzy. "We'll do it here," said the nurse. "We'll be quick. We'll do it with dignity." Her voice was a small, steady stone in the flow of everything else. Conceição watched the procedure with a quiet that was thick with possibility. She held her rosary looped in one hand, not in prayer that demanded miraculous intervention, but as a familiar object in uncertain time. Pequeno sat a little apart, legs crossed, eyes on the scene, as if feeling the scene's possibilities and threats in an old scar. After the samples were taken, there was a moment of silence. No one spoke at length. The nurse sealed the tubes and placed them in a labeled envelope. The label read, São Lucas, DNA request. Marina's hands shook as she took the envelope, then steadied when Rodrigo reached to place a supportive palm on her shoulder. Conceição placed a hand on the boys' heads. The small community watched and resumed its rhythms. Someone mended a net. The sizzle of a pan started again at Rosa's stall. Sir Joachim whistled softly as he returned to his sorting. They agreed on the conditions. The children could be brought to a neutral facility for the test, accompanied by Conceição. If results indicated a biological link, there would be a process of negotiation, not abrupt removal, but a humane transition. If results did not support Marina and Rodrigo's claim, then what would happen? The question hung like a bruise in the air, raw and unanswered. Yet even as the fear surfaced for both men and women present, a practical plan held them. Safe travel to the health post, proper documentation, clear communication. The city's institutions, Hospital São Lucas included, would be called upon to participate, but all present understood the need to proceed with care. Before leaving, Marina held Pedro and Paulo again. This time she whispered small facts to them she barely remembered. The way the diaper smelled of a new life, the shape of a first yawn, the tiny cry that had once kept her awake, with a tenderness that made the days luminous. The boys did not understand the litany. They felt the tone, and that was enough. It was enough to anchor a moment in time. Marina's fingers in a child's hair, conceiving anew of a life she had thought ended. On the drive back toward the city center, the envelope rested on Marina's lap, heavier than it seemed it should be. The swab inside carried more than cells. It carried the possibility of rewriting 2 years of living. João Paulo sat forward, looking out at the passing buildings, a small silhouette against the bright window. Outside, the world rushed by, indifferent. Inside the car, winds of grief and hope and practical fear moved together in a way that left them all exhausted. They had arranged for samples to reach a lab that worked with São Lucas, a place with a reputation for care and accuracy. The nurse had promised the results would take 3 days. It was the kind of waiting that turned hope into a tactile thing. You could feel it like a weight in the body, like a small animal pacing in a cage. They had 3 days to prepare emotionally for news that could make them light or break them anew. Back at their tiny apartment, Marina placed the sealed envelope in a drawer and held her hands over it, as if over an altar. Rodrigo sat at the small kitchen table, hands folded, staring at nothing in particular. That night, Marina dreamed of 2 small faces looking back at her from a river. In the dream, the faces had the same eyes as the boys she had touched, and when she woke, she felt both closer and farther than before. The first night of the 3-day wait brought a storm. Rain came heavy and immediate, slapping the tin roofs and running in silver sheets down the streets. Marina listened to it as if it were a soundtrack for her unsettled thoughts. The city swelled with sound. The image of the dump, of Conceição's steady hands, of the boy's small feet crossing the dirt, burned behind her eyelids. In the hours that stretched between the taking of the swab and the promise of an answer, the city's institutions began to stir. Officials at São Lucas were notified that a community health outreach had carried samples. The hospital's name, so familiar to Marina, got entangled in paper trails and phone calls. The memory of the earlier loss, 2 years and 3 months ago, began to cast a long shadow in the minds of those working at the hospital. But for the moment, the work remained a quiet, logistical thing, tracking tubes, ensuring chain of custody, and waiting for lab time. On the second day, Conceição came to visit Marina and Rodrigo, bringing a small loaf of bread and a blanket she had stitched from old shirts. She sat on the edge of the bed where the photograph lay face down and told stories that had nothing to do with biology. Stories of street festivals, of a teenage boy who had once slept beneath a mango tree and woke to find his pocket full of coins, of the way a stray dog had sat vigil for 3 mornings beside a fire. Her tone was showing them a life the boys inhabited and which would remain a part of them regardless of the test's outcome. She did not ask for thanks. She only wanted to share. Rodrigo listened and felt an unfamiliar pressure behind his sternness, a realization that the problem ahead was not simply a question of fatherhood, but of connection. The law, the lab, the paper would answer whether the boys belonged to them biologically. But the boys' world had been built on other foundations, on someone's watchful night and someone's patience. The negotiation that would follow would need to hold both truths. Marina went back to the photograph, to the soft, fragile thing that had held 2 little faces against a time that kept moving. She pressed her forehead to the frame and thought of the small, simple acts that make a life. She thought of the ways a child's shoes bend at the toe because of a specific step, because of the path chosen. She thought of how Conceição had bent and mended, and given what she could, and how a hospital's factual error could ripple outwards, touching lives in ways no single report could contain. On the morning the 3rd day began, the city felt like a held breath. Marina wrapped a scarf around her shoulders and made coffee that tasted of nothing. She walked to the window and watched the street. People passed. A courier with a box, children to school, a woman balancing a market basket. Somewhere between the routines, the envelope would move through a chain of hands and machines, and eventually a printed report would come back with figures and a seal. They had asked the hospital to send a liaison, not to take over, but to be present when the result was delivered. It was a cautious step, meant to ensure transparency. The liaison, when she came, was composed and precise, someone whose day was full of other life-and-death logistics, but who knew the language of empathy enough to hand it carefully when needed. She told Marina and Rodrigo that the lab would call that afternoon, and that São Lucas would meet them at a local clinic to help interpret the official paperwork. Her manner reassured them minimally. When you are waiting for proof, no reassurance feels adequate. At noon, João Paulo arrived at their apartment without a knock. Marina opened the door and found him holding a small, battered book of comic strips. He passed it to the boys without a word. They had kept something of their world in the dump and moved it into hers. In that moment, the two domains touched. Two domains. When the courier finally left with the sealed envelope bound for the lab in the hospital's district center, Rodrigo watched as its flap was folded and stamped. He felt a heavy smallness in his chest, the knowledge that a few lines of print could pivot the trajectory of years. Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent and kind in its continuities. A boy selling peanuts, a couple arguing about a washing machine, a man tuning a guitar. Night fell and rain came again. Marina lay awake and brewed the day's memory into a stream of small images. A boy's pointed finger, Conceição's hands, the quiet way Pedro had looked at her. She found that she could not name the emotion exactly. It was a mixture of fear and a kind of stubborn hope that had nothing to do with rational probability. It was a hope that was born not of certainty, but of responsibility. They had, in a few days, crossed a threshold into a life in which choices would have consequences, not only for them, but for the men and women who had kept these boys alive. The city hummed with possibilities and dangers, both. Marina understood that whatever the result, they were being asked to reconfigure more than a family. They were, by necessity, being asked to transform the small political economy of affection and care that existed between the hospital, the community, and the families who lived at the margins. As the envelope moved through hands, the pile of small objects in the apartment, a toy car, the photograph, a blanket with Conceição's stitching, gathered meaning. They were emblems of a life that had never been wholly lost. They were also reminders that returning a child to a parent, if the science proved the link, would be only the first step in a process of repair that would require patience and imagination. Before the sun rose on the third morning, a neighbor called with news of a community meeting in the West Zone. The dump's residents had learned that something formal was taking place. They had their own opinions about what needed to happen. Marina felt a sudden, sharp awareness of the stakes. The boys were not simply hers or Conceição's. They were already part of a web of care and obligation that included neighbors, small entrepreneurs, and the people at Rosa's stall who had watched them grow. If the test brought them home, it would be to a family that would need to stretch its arms to include a whole community's history. The day moved with a slow inevitability. A phone call would come in the afternoon, they had been told. Until then, they did what people do when a future is uncertain. They made small plans. Marina wrote a note to the school she might enroll the boys in. Rodrigo measured spaces in their small apartment and calculated where extra beds could go. Conceição gathered a small bundle, a bowl, a blanket, things she thought the boys might need if they left that day or if they stayed. She approached the logistics as someone who had made meaning from scarcity. When the clinic's phone finally rang, every sound in the room tuned to the signal. Hands found each other, breath held. The call would be the pivot. The city paused in a way it only does for a moment before the turn of a page. The clinic's phone sliced through the afternoon like a bell. Marina's hand tightened around Rodrigo's until it ached. Across the small table, the sealed envelope they had watched go through machines and hands sat like something quiet and terrible. The liaison from São Lucas spoke slowly, the way people do when they are passing a fragile truth from one mouth to another. She read the line that would unmoor them. The laboratory reports a 99% probability of paternity and maternity for Pedro and Paulo. Sound folded back into the room. The static click of a radiator, a neighbor's radio through the thin wall, the nurse inhaling. Then the breath left Marina in one long, sudden exhale that carried equal parts surrender and recognition. Her knees bent. Rodrigo's expression unraveled in a way Marina had not seen since the funeral, the hardness around his mouth giving over to a rawness that made his face look softer, more human. He reached for her before she could reach for him, as if some formal map of the present insisted on practical contact. A steady hand, an anchor. They did not scream. There were no cinematic releases of joy. The moment held the gravitas of truth, settling into its place. Marina pressed her palm against her sternum, feeling the sudden return of a heartbeat she had thought lost. The liaison, woman with the gentle precision, stayed on the line long enough to explain the protocol. A written report would follow. San Lucas would offer support in the form of liaison services while they arranged the transition. A representative would come to meet with Conceição and the community to discuss the next steps. There would be paperwork, they said, and time taken to ensure things happened with dignity. In the car afterward, the city felt altered. Windows filmed with rain in small streaks that refracted streetlights into a glittering, improbable procession. Juan Paulo sat with his knuckles white on the back of the seat. He had known, in his way, that he had done something irreducible that day. He had pointed and changed a course. Now the pointing's consequence lay in the quiet sound of paper being moved and names read aloud. He did not smile. He had expected something like this. He had learned to expect that truth sometimes needed the weight of machines, but he had not expected how much quieter the news would feel when it finally arrived. Conceição met them that evening at the dump's edge, as she always did, an arrival that felt unhurried and certain. She had a thermos and a towel across her arm, simple things that were curative to the place. When Marina told her, voice catching on the words, Conceição only nodded and closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She did not leap into possessive rage or public claim-making. Instead, she folded herself into the pragmatic rhythm of someone who had always made space for how lives had to be divided and shared. "We will do this slowly," Conceição said. "For the boys, not for you or for me." Her voice was small, but steady. "No outrage today. We will make a plan." That plan took shape in the work of the next fortnight. San Lucas sent a liaison, and after a review of their files and interviews with staff, a statement was drafted, measured, not theatrical, but clear. The hospital acknowledged that there had been an error in the documentation of the newborn's disposition 2 years and 3 months earlier, and that they would provide reparations to the affected family and allocate funds for community support in the West Zone's Lixo. The wording avoided dramatic accusations. It was a recognition of institutional failure and a proposal for repair. For Marina, the phrasing was less important than the consequence. Funding for a small health post and a school support program for the dump. Resources that could begin to undo some of the harm that came from neglect and from bureaucratic mistakes. Dr. Santos, whose name had been folded into the hospital's long roster of staff, visited the dump and met Conceição and community representatives in a cleared lot that served as a meeting place. He did not come with the flourish of formal apologies on banners. He sat on a plastic crate and listened as the women and men of the Lixo spoke about what they needed. Antibiotics that could be reliably provided, midwives' supplies, a roof over the daytime clinic. He promised what the hospital could provide: funding for a small health post, regular outreach visits, and a scholarship fund for local children. The word legal did not figure into the immediate conversation. They spoke instead of tools to keep babies from pneumonia, vaccines for toddlers, support to keep children in school. Conceição negotiated with a clarity that surprised the visiting officials. Her terms were practical. The boys must be treated gently in their transition. She would continue to be present. The boys would be allowed visits to the Lixo twice a week. A committee including community members would oversee the use of San Lucas's funds. It was not the language of bitterness. It was the language of a person insisting that when the world shifted, the people who had stayed must not be erased. Marina and Rodrigo accepted these terms, and they were careful to speak of them as part of a larger promise. They did not want to be thieves of the life Conceição had kept. They wanted to be parents who honored what the boys already knew. The arrangement was written down and witnessed, not a courtroom decree, but a human contract signed over cups of sweet tea in a makeshift courtyard. The first week of integration was a study in small violences and tender mercies. Marina spent mornings at a pediatric clinic learning how to administer medicine, how to read a chart. Rodrigo, who had once measured the world in spreadsheets and invoices, learned to assemble a crib and to coax a boy who had been suspicious of closed doors into a routine at home. Pedro and Paulo came home with backpacks that smelled of detergent and the faint odor of the dump, an odor that would take months to wash out of their bodies. They clung to the toy car and the blanket Conceição had stitched. Marina made a place for each object on a shelf, and learned, awkwardly and with love, to keep the shelf like a small museum of continuity. Nights were the hardest. The twins woke from dreams that had nothing to do with them, and everything to do with the forms of loss that had filled their earliest days. The scraping of something sharp, the smell of smoke, an emptiness that sprang wide in their chests. Marina learned to sit with one while Rodrigo slept with the other. Sometimes the boys swapped between them like the tide. A child psychologist, arranged by São Lucas's outreach, came twice a week and taught them ways to name feeling. Not to erase the past, but to hold it and to map a future that could be trusted. The sessions were quiet, simple games, art with crayons, a focused patience that never demanded too much. One evening, 2 months after the results, Pedro spiked a high fever. Pneumonia, the doctor said, and the word fell like a stone into a pond that had already been full of small ripples. The hospital admitted him. Conceição came with them in a van paid for with hospital outreach funds and sat by his bedside, hands folded, rosary looped but not clutched. Marina slept in a fold-out chair and watched the monitor's soft beeps. Rodrigo washed his face in the nearest sink and spoke in whispers to a nurse about how to hold a fragile chest. The boy's breathing was shallow. The days were long. For the first time since the reunion, fear cut through the newly woven cautious joy. Pedro improved gradually under antibiotics and oxygen. The hospital staff, some of whom had been part of the original years ago, attended with an almost shy professionalism, as if they were making amends through steady service rather than grand gestures. Conceição's presence at the hospital shifted something in Marina. She saw the older woman feed the boy a spoonful of soup with the same tenderness she herself offered, and in that act the old conflict softened into a mutual, if sometimes uneasy, alliance. At the bedside, Marina thanked Conceição simply, and Conceição answered by squeezing her hand in a way that made a small bridge between them. Months folded into a year. The twins began school with classes arranged by the scholarship fund from São Lucas. They were clumsy at first, small children in uniforms that felt like borrowed armor, but they collected friends with the speed of children who needed company. They learned to relate to time differently, a school bell, rather than the unpredictability of a day's haul. The psychologist's visits became less frequent. Therapy shifted from crisis to growth. The sessions taught Marina and Rodrigo how to meet intrusive memories with routines that anchored the children's days. Juan Paulo remained a hinge between worlds. He came to the apartment often, at first as a kind of guide for the twins, then as a loved older child. He brought other boys from the dump sometimes, for football in the alley outside the apartment building, for pizza night when Marina decided to splurge. His nickname, Biquinho, traveled with him into the new house as a piece of identity he chose to keep. In quiet moments, Rodrigo took him aside and taught him to change a tire, to read a bus schedule, to open a bank account. It was awkward and generous at once. Juan Paulo learned to navigate municipal paperwork and to talk about futures in ways that were once foreign to him. Conceição's twice-weekly visits became a part of the family's rhythm. She would arrive with a sack of fresh yucca or a pie, sit in the living room while the twins did homework, and then walk back to the dump carrying small packages for neighbors. The boys went to the dump twice a week as agreed, visiting the makeshift market and the small patch of ground where they had once run. They could move between places with less tension than before, though each visit came bundled with small tests. A night of insomnia, a sudden silence at dinner, a refusal to sleep alone. Marina learned to send texts to Conceição and to ask for advice on how to soothe a bedtime fear. In return, Conceição learned to call Marina when she saw a cough or a scrape, to ask whether a school permission slip had been signed. The contact kept both their lives honest. As the first real winter after the reunion arrived, new tensions surfaced. The boys grieved in hidden ways. They asked for names and dates and for explanations about the grave where their names were written. They wanted to know why someone had told their mother they were gone. Marina answered as directly as she could, with facts about the hospital, with apologies where she could offer them, with the truth that sometimes life is messy and people make mistakes. Rodrigo handled more of the logistical work, appointments, school forms, the bureaucratic scaffolding that allowed life to move forward. A turning point came less from big events than from small ones repeated. A father's hands learning how to braid hair because one of the boys had long hair, the smell of a stew that meant Conceição had been by, a community fete where the hospital's health post opened its doors, and a nurse gave vaccinations to toddlers without the long lines the dump used to face. São Lucas officially donated the funds, and a small ribbon-cutting ceremony was held for the health post. A simple placard hung on the corrugated wall, and a midwife taught a class the following week. The action was practical rather than grand. A consistent clinic shift, a small medicine cabinet, a refrigerator for vaccines. For many, it was the first time a promise had translated into a resource they could count on. Almost 2 years after the test, Marina discovered she was pregnant. The news arrived not as an answer to all wounds, but as an invitation to a new kind of responsibility. She was careful in telling the twins and Conceição, not wanting to fold the old loss into a glittering new hope, but she could not help how her body shivered with the possibility of a child she would raise without the doubt that had stalked Pedro and Paulo's earliest months. She went back to São Lucas to be seen by the same clinic that had once failed them. This time, the visits felt like folding into a place that had been remade by accountability. Doctor Santos offered congratulations in a quiet way and said he would make sure the antenatal care was thorough. The birth of Lucas came on a humid evening in late spring, when jacaranda flowers had begun to stipple the city with purple. Marina held a small vibrating hand in hers and cried, not tears of sudden completeness, but of many things knit together, exhaustion, relief, a tired kind of joy. Rodrigo laughed aloud when he held the baby for the first time, a laugh that had been rarer in their years of grief. Conceição was there, sitting on a plastic chair by the bed, a small smile on her face. She placed a folded blanket on the windowsill and whispered, not a claim or a reproach, but a benediction that sounded like a prayer for all the children in the world. Lucas's arrival did not erase the past. It reframed it. In the weeks after, Marina would cradle him and think of the twins' first cold nights, of the way bodies can be tender and stubborn at once. Lucas became a small emblem of repair. No miracle, only the slow labor of love that rebuilds after rupture. The family's first days with 3 children were messy and luminous. They learned to set schedules that could hold more than one child's needs, to share a bed on nights when a fever rose, to let Conceição feed Lucas crackers with a certain crooked efficiency that made him laugh. The hospital's reparations, however, did not end at bricks and vaccines. São Lucas funded a small pilot program in the dump, a daytime learning center staffed with local teachers, an apprenticeship program for teenagers, and a micro-grant initiative that helped neighbors start small food stalls. The hospital sent accountants to work with the community committee and respected the committee's decision to prioritize a health post and school support. Over the next year, the health post's visiting nurse, an articulate woman named Rosa, who had trained in community care, became a familiar figure in both the dump and the clinic. She would stitch wounds, counsel families, and sometimes, with a careful humor, chide Rodrigo for not learning how to properly wrap a child's arm. Marina and Rodrigo, who had once moved inwards around a private grief, found themselves pulled into a public life they had not sought. They began, tentatively, to speak at small meetings about how families can be rebuilt after institutional failure. They worked with Conceição to set up a small NGO, first a name on a paper, then an office in a donated room, that supported children in the West Zone. The NGO focused on three things: legal assistance for families, psychological support for children, and small community grants. It was imperfect and chronically underfunded, but it became a scaffold for work that the hospital's reparations could not fully cover, the slow, patient labor of building trust. João Paulo's path took another turn. He enrolled in a vocational program that taught refrigeration maintenance and basic electronics. The program was partly supported by the microgrant initiative and partly by a small scholarship from the NGO. He was good with tools, and over time he learned to fix the stove, to read a schematic, to talk about saving money in ways that made sense. At 20, he had an apprenticeship and a small savings account. One afternoon, having sat for months through paperwork and conversation, Rodrigo asked him if he would consider making their family permanent. The question was soft, lacking theatricality. It carried the practical weight of a man who wanted to offer a roof and a legal status to someone who had been the pivot in a defining moment of their lives. The adoption process, when it came, was not a cinematic leap, but a sequence of polite patient actions, home evaluations, social worker interviews, signed documents. João Paulo's adoption happened on a raining Tuesday, with a courthouse clerk and a small cake at the apartment. They called him João Paulo officially now, and sometimes Biquinho when they were being tender. He kept the nickname as a talisman of who he had been and who he had become. Time, which had once carved grief into Marina's hands, now offered the family small, cumulative proofs of endurance. The twins' school reports with neat handwriting, Lucas's first laugh, João Paulo's certificate of apprenticeship folded into a drawer. There were setbacks, an outbreak of stomach flu that sent the household into a sleepless night, a dispute about who would care for the boys when Marina had to travel for a meeting, but these fit into a new muscle for endurance. The family learned to work together, to convene around practical problems with the same steadiness they had once reserved for funerals. 5 years on from that day at the cemetery, a span that carried the weight of 2 years and 3 months as a hinge that had turned their lives, the community inaugurated a small building with a modest plaque, Centro de Saúde e Aprendizagem, in partnership with São Lucas. Dr. Santos cut the ribbon with a pair of scissors that shook a little, and Marina, holding Lucas in her hip, watched as children from the dump and the neighborhood lined up for toothbrushes and story time. João Paulo, with grease on his fingernails, led an electricity safety class for teenagers. Conceição sat near the door like a queen of small kindnesses, and people from Rosa's stall brought coffee. The building was not a cathedral of charity. It was a pragmatic cluster of rooms where vaccines could be stored in a fridge, where an underpaid teacher could grade homework, where parents could come to learn about nutrition. It was, for many, the first time a promise had become a place. There were more moments of public acknowledgement that did not feel like spectacle. São Lucas released a brief statement in which the administration regretted the error and outlined ongoing support for community programs. There was no legal theatre. There were instead meetings, written commitments, and a fund that supported health workers and the scholarship program. For Marina, the hospital's public recognition was a complicated relief. It did not erase what had been lost, but it made manifest a shared responsibility. 10 years later, the family had a portrait that would have been unimaginable on that cemetery afternoon. João Paulo completed an evening course and began mentoring younger boys. Pedro and Paulo, now at depths of laughter and mischief, were fluent in both the lingua of the dump and the routines of school. They had friends who were not defined by scarcity, but by shared play. Lucas, lanky and curious, asked 1,000 questions and knew the comforting cadence of 2 mothers in his life, one by birth and one by vocation, both maternal in their claim. Conceição, older but still vital, oversaw the NGO's community board and sat weekly at the cafe that had been refurbished with microgrant funds. The health post had a small solar panel and a waiting room with books. The NGO had a small staff and a volunteer network, and its annual meeting drew people who had once been neighbors and strangers. They returned once every year on an afternoon that favored soft light to the cemetery where the original photograph had been placed. Marina knelt and smoothed the grass. The stone was unchanged in its simple truth, names etched, dates retired to eternity. The boys stood close, their hands finding each other. João Paulo brushed a pebble into place with a careful thumb. A small voice broke the quiet then. Lucas, at 8, looking at the stone and the group, asked the question children always seem to ask of complex webs. Why did you put their faces there? He meant the photograph, the grief, the action that had once seemed to close a book. Marina smiled in that way that held both the old wound and the new peace. She told him briefly the part that needed saying, that once 2 small babies were thought to be gone, but some people had kept them safe when others had not known. She told him about João Paulo's pointed finger and Conceição's watchful hands and the slow work that followed. She did not wrap the story in tidy edges. She told it as a life is told, with loss and with the steady steps of repair that followed. They stayed there a long while, not with ceremony but with a domestic quiet that had become their family's way of keeping memory alive without letting it define them. The twins ran to a nearby tree and climbed, howling with a joy that was new and precise. João Paulo found a low branch and swung, hair in his eyes, smiling the way a person smiles when gratitude and living meet. Conceição watched them, and when Marina leaned into her, she pressed a hand to Marina's shoulder as if to say, "We did what we had to." The cemetery, once the scene of a punctured life, had become a place where continuity and rupture sat together, where a child's finger could point and set into motion not just the painful puzzle of an institution's failure, but the slow, communal labor of remediation. The dump had not disappeared. It had been changed by attention and by funds, and by neighbors' insistence that children should have different options. Families had multiplied their ties instead of shrinking them. In private, Marina kept the photograph in a drawer still, because some things need the weight of seeing. But she also had another habit. When she woke in the morning, she went to the small window and watched the street. She saw João Paulo sometimes on his way to work, saw the twins return from school with laughter, saw Lucas carrying a newspaper as if he were already older than he was. She thought of the day a small boy had pointed at a grave and altered the lines of their life, and she felt not a tidy gratitude, but a steadiness that comes from having chosen in pain and in care to meet the demands of another life. If you felt this story, share it with someone who needs to hear that repair takes time.